On their wedding night, Chinedu and Mma were alone in their room, hearts racing with excitement. It was finally time for them to express their love in a way they had both waited for. The moonlight spilled into the room, casting a soft glow on their faces. Chinedu walked slowly toward Mma, his eyes filled with warmth and affection. He took her hands gently and whispered, "I want every touch, every kiss, and every moment tonight to remind you how deeply I care for you. You are the most precious person in my life." Mma's heart swelled with love. She stared into his eyes, feeling the warmth of his words. Then, without saying a word, she kissed him softly, letting the moment consume them. Chinedu held her close, his hands caressing her as their love began to unfold in the stillness of the night. But just as they were lost in the intensity of the moment, a loud, piercing scream shattered the calm. It was the queen. "Ugo! Ugo!" she cried. The sound of her voice sent chills down Mma's spine. She and Chinedu sprang apart, fear gripping their hearts. Without hesitation, they rushed downstairs, their minds racing with worry. When they arrived, chaos had broken loose. Ugo, Mma's beloved son, was lying on the ground, unconscious. His small body looked lifeless, and no matter what anyone did, he wouldn't wake up. The queen was in tears, and the palace staff frantically tried to revive him, but nothing worked. Mma's heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. She fell to her knees beside Ugo, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Ugo, wake up! Please!" she begged, her voice shaking with fear. The king, seeing the terror on Mma's face, immediately ordered the guards to fetch a nearby herbalist. The herbalist arrived swiftly, chanting incantations and mixing herbs, but after hours of effort, Ugo was still unconscious. Mma's tears seemed endless as the night wore on, and she couldn't shake the horrible thought that she might lose her only child. The following morning, the palace was filled with tension. The king had summoned another herbalist, hoping for a miracle. But once again, nothing worked. 3 days passed, and Ugo remained unconscious. Mma stayed by his side day and night, unable to rest, her heart heavy with worry. The king called for every herbalist in the village, but no one could help. Each time someone new tried, hope would flicker for a moment, only to be crushed when Ugo failed to stir. As desperation took hold, the king knew there was only one person left who might help, the chief priest. But he hesitated. The memories of Ugo's birth, tied to the chief priest and the painful agreement Mma had made, haunted him. He didn't want to turn to the chief priest, not after everything that had happened. But with Ugo's life hanging in the balance and Mma's heart breaking more each day, the king knew he had no other choice. He sent for the chief priest. When the priest arrived, the air grew thick with tension. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the room. "I cannot perform any rituals here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "If you want me to save the boy, he must be brought to my shrine." Mma's heart sank at the thought. She had sworn never to return to the shrine, never to face the place where so much had been taken from her. But now, Ugo's life was at stake. She looked at the king, her eyes pleading. They had no other option. Despite the fear and hesitation, they knew they had to do whatever it took to save Ugo. The king, after much deliberation, nodded. "We will take him to the shrine." His voice was steady, but everyone could sense the unease in the room. As the guards prepared to take Ugo to the shrine, Mma could barely contain her fear. She stood close to her son, whispering to him, "Mama is here. Please be strong." Her hands trembled as she stroked his face, praying that this terrifying journey would bring her boy back to her. Ugo was taken to the chief priest's shrine, his body limp as Mma and the others watched in fear. The shrine was dark and cold, filled with strange carvings and symbols. Mma held Ugo's hand tightly, hoping and praying that he would wake up. Hours passed slowly. Every tick of the clock felt like a lifetime. Mma was exhausted from worry and fear, but she refused to leave Ugo's side. The king paced back and forth, his face full of concern, while Chinedu stood close by, his eyes never leaving Ugo. Then, 4 hours later, something incredible happened. Ugo's small fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, he opened his eyes. Everyone gasped in relief. Mma cried out in joy, holding her son close. "Ugo, my son, you're awake!" The king, overwhelmed with happiness, turned to the chief priest and asked, "What happened? Why did this happen to Ugo?" The chief priest's face was serious as he explained, "The gods are angry. Ugo is my son by right. He was born from the agreement between me and Mma. He belongs to the shrine, and the gods are punishing him because he has not been living here with me. Mma only served me for 1.5 years, but she promised 5 years. She must return to the shrine with Ugo for the remaining 3.5 years. If not, Ugo will fall unconscious again, and this time, he will not wake up." Emma's heart sank. She had just gotten married to Chinedu, and now she was being told to leave her new life behind and return to the chief priest's house. She couldn't believe this was happening. Tears flowed from her eyes as she imagined losing Ugo again. The thought of him collapsing and never waking up terrified her. That night, when they returned to the palace, the mood was heavy. The king was furious, pacing angrily, while the queen wept quietly. Mma sat alone in her room, thinking about the terrible choice she had to make. She could either stay at the palace and risk losing Ugo, or go back to the shrine, giving up her new life and happiness with Chinedu. After much arguing and back-and-forth discussions, Mma made up her mind. She decided that to save Ugo's life, she would have to return to the chief priest's house. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her son. The king and Chinedu tried to convince her to stay, but her mind was already made up. 2 days later, Mma packed her belongings, took Ugo by the hand, and left the palace. The journey back to the chief priest's house was long and painful. Ugo, still young and confused, didn't understand why they had to leave the palace. He didn't know the full story of his birth, and Mma had never told him about the chief priest's role in their lives. That night, in the dark, cold hut of the chief priest, Ugo woke Mma up. His eyes were full of questions. "Mama, why are we here? Why did we leave the palace? I don't understand." Mma hesitated. How could she tell her young son about the terrible things that had happened? But she knew Ugo deserved the truth. So, with tears in her eyes, she told him everything. She told him about her mother's illness, the deal she made with the chief priest, and how he took advantage of her innocence. She explained how, even after her mother died, the chief priest forced her to stay and serve him. She told him how Ugo was born as a result of all that. Ugo listened in silence, his face growing pale with anger and sadness. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So the chief priest, he's the reason for all this? He hurt you, Mama?" Mma nodded, her heart breaking as she saw the pain in her son's eyes. "Yes, my son, but you are not to blame. None of this is your fault." Ugo cried with Mma that night, holding her tightly. From that moment on, Ugo's hatred for the chief priest began to grow. The next day, the chief priest tried to be friendly, calling Ugo my son, but Ugo hated it. He couldn't stand the sight of the man who had caused so much pain for his mother. The chief priest had 3 other boys who lived with him and served him. Ugo refused to talk to them. Instead, he focused on making the chief priest's life miserable. He was just a boy, but in his heart, he felt strong and determined. He wanted revenge for what the chief priest had done. One day, the chief priest asked one of the boys to fetch water for his bath. While the water was being prepared, Ugo snuck into the bathroom and secretly poured a handful of pepper into the water. Then he waited. When the chief priest began his bath, everything seemed normal at first, but halfway through, he suddenly screamed in pain. His skin felt like it was burning. He jumped out of the bath, shouting for help, running around naked and panicked. The other boys rushed to help, bringing palm oil to soothe the burning. It was a wild scene, with the chief priest yelling and flailing about while the others tried to calm him down. Ugo stood in the corner, hiding a smile. He had caused the chief priest discomfort, and for the first time in a long while, Ugo felt a small sense of justice. He was determined to make the chief priest pay, little by little. Though just a boy, Ugo's heart was set on frustrating the man who had caused his mother so much pain. Chinedu visited Mma and Ugo as often as he could, never wanting them to feel alone. Sometimes Mma and Ugo would visit the palace too, but it was always hard for Mma to leave again. The king and Chinedu had not given up. They were still trying to find a way to bring Mma and Ugo home for good, but nothing seemed to work. One day, The king went to the chief priest again, desperate for a solution. "Tell me what you want," the king said. "Any amount of money, any gift. Just let Mma and Ugo come home." But the chief priest shook his head. "The gods do not want money," he said. "Ugo is my son and he must stay in my house, and Mma must serve the rest of her years as promised." The Ovoko New Yam Festival was fast approaching. It was the biggest celebration in the village, and people from all the nearby villages were getting ready to attend. The chief priest was one of the most important performers for the event, and he had been busy preparing everything for weeks. He had an important role to play during the rituals, and everyone was looking forward to the festival. The morning of the festival arrived, and the chief priest was getting ready. He asked his servants to prepare his food since it was going to be a long day. But what the chief priest didn't know was that Ugo had snuck into the kitchen earlier. Ugo was always looking for ways to frustrate the chief priest, and this time he added a special herb to the priest's food, one that would cause terrible stomach problems. After the chief priest finished eating, he headed to the festival, not knowing what was about to happen. At the festival, everyone was dancing, singing, and enjoying the celebration. But soon, the chief priest started to feel strange. His stomach was making loud, rumbling noises, and he felt very uncomfortable. When it was time for the chief priest to cut the yam, a key part of the celebration, he was called to the front. As he started the ritual, his stomach began to churn uncontrollably. He tried to continue, but the pressure was too much. Suddenly, in front of the entire crowd, the chief priest had an accident. He defecated in his clothes, right there in front of everyone. The villagers gasped in shock, and then a wave of laughter and embarrassment swept through the crowd. Children began chanting, smelling priest," over and over. The chief priest's face turned red with shame. One of his servants rushed to grab his hand, leading him away from the festival as the crowd continued to laugh and mock him. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. Ugo, watching from a distance, couldn't hide his satisfaction. He felt proud for causing the chief priest such embarrassment. But for Mma, life in the chief priest's house was becoming unbearable. 2 months passed, and the burden of living there was weighing heavily on her. She cried almost every day, missing her mother and her freedom. She missed the life she could have had with Chinedu. One night, after crying for hours, Mma couldn't take it anymore. She left her hut quietly and walked to the chief priest's shrine. Kneeling down before it, Mma poured out her heart in prayer. "Oh, God of our ancestors," she said, her voice trembling. "You are a just God. I have suffered for so long. I was just a child when the chief priest took advantage of me. I wanted to save my mother, and I did what I thought was right. But now I ask, do I deserve this suffering? Do I deserve to be trapped here for the rest of my life?" Her tears flowed as she spoke. "Please, God, plead my case. I'm at the end of my strength. I cannot bear this pain anymore. I am begging you. Do I deserve this for trying to save my mother? Please show me justice." Mma stayed there for a long time, crying and pouring out her heart. She felt as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. After what felt like hours, she finally stood up, wiped her tears, and returned to her hut. But in her heart, she hoped that somehow, some way, her prayers would be answered. From that day forward, something began to shift in Mma's spirit. Though she didn't know how or when, she believed that justice would come. The gods had to hear her cries, and she knew that they would not ignore her forever. A week later, the chief priest started feeling very sick. At first, he only had a fever, but soon he couldn't even stand up. His sickness became so bad that he couldn't control his body anymore. He would wet his clothes and mess himself, unable to stop it. His servants tried to take care of him, giving him herbs and doing special chants, but nothing worked. Ugo and Mma didn't care much about the chief priest's illness. They were too hurt and angry to feel sorry for him. As the days went by, the chief priest's condition got worse. Big, painful boils appeared all over his body, and his servants didn't know what else to do. Desperate, they called for other priests from nearby villages to help. When these priests arrived, they consulted the gods to find out what was happening. They told the chief priest that the gods were angry with him because he had wronged an innocent girl, and he needed to confess his sins to the whole village to make things right. The chief priest refused. He told them he would never confess. Even when more priests came and told him the same thing, he still refused to admit his wrongs. He stayed in bed, getting worse every day. His servants, tired of caring for him, finally gave up and left him alone. Now, with no one to help him, the chief priest lay there, too weak to do anything as his illness grew stronger. Days passed, and the chief priest realized that he was close to dying. He knew he had no choice but to confess. One day, with a weak voice, he called Ugo to his side. "Go to the palace," he said, "and tell the king to gather all the villagers. I must speak to them." Ugo, though still angry, obeyed and ran to the palace to deliver the message. Soon the whole village gathered in the village square, wondering what the chief priest had to say. When the chief priest was brought before the villagers, he was barely able to stand. His voice was shaky and his body was covered in sores. In front of everyone, he finally told the truth. He admitted everything he had done to Mma. "It wasn't the gods who told me to make her serve me," he confessed. "I did it because I was jealous. When Mma married Chinedu, I wanted her for myself, so I cursed her son Ugo with sickness to bring them both back to me." The crowd gasped in shock. Mma stood there with tears in her eyes, her heart filled with both anger and relief. The chief priest's guilt weighed heavily on him, and the moment he finished speaking, he collapsed. He died right there in front of everyone. The king, furious at the priest's wickedness, ordered that his body be thrown into the evil forest for the vultures to eat, a punishment reserved for the worst people. Tears streamed down Mma's face, but this time they were tears of joy. She had been through so much pain, and now it was finally over. That same day, Mma packed her things, took Ugo by the hand, and they left the chief priest's house for good. As they walked back to the palace, she felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was free at last. When they arrived at the palace, everyone welcomed them with open arms. Chinedu rushed to hug Mma and Ugo, his eyes filled with love and relief. Mma knew that her nightmare was finally over. That night, for the first time in a long while, Mma felt truly happy. She and Chinedu shared a deep and emotional moment, making love and promising each other that they would never be apart again. Chinedu looked into Mma's eyes and vowed to give her a life full of happiness. The next morning, the king gathered everyone in the palace. He had an important announcement to make. "Chinedu," the king said, "you have shown great strength and love. It is time for you to lead. I am giving you the throne." With that, Chinedu was crowned the new king of Ovoko land, and Mma became the queen. As the new king and queen of Ovoko land, Mma and Chinedu ruled with kindness and wisdom. They worked together to bring peace and happiness to the village. Mma, who had once been so scared and hurt, now stood tall and proud by her husband's side. The villagers loved their new queen, and they admired how brave she had been through all the hard times. 3 years later, Mma and Chinedu were blessed with twins, a baby boy and a baby girl. Their children brought even more joy into their lives, and the palace was filled with laughter and happiness every day. Ugo, who had gone through so much, was now a strong young boy who loved his family deeply. He often helped his father, the king, and learned about being a great leader. Together, Mma, Chinedu, and their children lived a life full of love and peace. Mma never forgot the hard journey she had been through, but she knew that it had made her stronger. Now, with her family by her side, she looked forward to a future filled with hope and joy. The village of Ovoko celebrated Mma and Chinedu's reign every year with a grand festival. The people would gather to honor their beloved king and queen, and the whole village would be filled with music, dancing, and laughter. Mma had come a long way from the scared girl who once feared for her life. Now, she was a queen, a mother, and a symbol of strength for her people. Though the memories of the past were still with her, Mma had found peace. She had learned that love and justice always win in the end. She often told her children stories of the past, teaching them about courage, honesty, and kindness. She made sure they knew that no matter what, they could overcome anything with love and faith. And so, Mma, Chinedu, Ugo, and the twins lived happily ever after, ruling Ovoko land with love and making sure their people were always safe and happy.